I'm Ed Nersessian, co-director of the center with Francis Levy, who is in Nigeria on a mission related to AIDS. Tonight's roundtable subject was suggested to us by Professor Cavell, who will be moderating tonight's roundtable. Marcia Cavell is a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, and she is the author of The Psychoanalytic Mind, From Freud to Philosophy. Books written by the participants of the roundtable tonight will be available for you to buy, if you wish, at the end of tonight's roundtable. Thank you.
Becoming a Subject, Ed. Also author of Becoming a Subject. You've got it over there.
Okay. It's there. Thank you. Yours.
You ready? Okay. This awful subject has been on my mind for many years. Beginning consciously, probably 30 years ago, when my analyst said to me one day, she said, "If only you could feel the right kind of guilt." Now, I didn't know what she meant, and I don't think I ever asked her what she meant. But I was deeply puzzled. And I won't say this is the only thing that motivated me, but it certainly was one of the things that led me to apply to become a research candidate at the Columbia Psychoanalytic Institute for Training and Research, which I did back in the 70s, and I studied there for 3 years. And then eventually I wrote an essay called Guilt and Guilt Feeling, which was primarily philosophical. But what I was struck by and puzzled by was the fact that guilt names both an emotion, of course, a very complex emotion. And I was a little surprised about the reference to neurobiology and guilt, because it seems to me it's far too complex emotion for neurobiology to have anything interesting to say about it at this point in its development, but maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. So it names a feeling or an emotion I think, rather than a feeling, but it also names a state. One can be guilty in relationship to something outside, something which you've done. Perhaps, certainly Freud thought, analysts think something which you've thought, guilty for a feeling, guilty for a wish, guilty for a desire, guilty for a fantasy, and so on. So I was puzzled about the connection between the emotional state and the state, that is the relationship between individual and, I don't want to say society, let me say world, certainly other persons. Guilt is I think basically an interpersonal feeling, though I think one can also feel guilty for not having accomplished what one set out to do, for not having lived up to one's own ego ideals, as psychoanalysts would say. And it was that relationship that I was exploring in that essay, and also in another essay that I wrote on Oedipus. So the question tonight, what is guilt? I take it to be asking questions both, again, about the emotional state, but also about, and here I think analysts are too quick to take emotions to be private matters, and guilt in particular to be a private matter, neurotic, having to do with the individual's fantasy life, and so on. Whereas there's a big question in philosophy whether or not moral statements and moral situations can be objectively true or false. I think most philosophers now think that there are such things as moral truths. Now, if there are such things as moral truths, it will also be the case, I would think, that people can really be guilty. But what? For having done something? No, for having done something which by their own lights is wrong. If I do something which is wrong by your lights, there's no call for a guilt feeling. But if I do something which is wrong by my lights, whether they're conscious or unconscious, that's a time for guilt feeling. So I finally take it, she's dead now, so I can't ask her, but I now understand what my analyst had in mind to be something like the following. The wrong sort of guilt is guilt repressed, guilt unacknowledged, guilt not even entertained when it should be entertained. And, quote, the right kind of guilt is guilt that is felt, I would say consciously, is not repressed, And it's felt towards things that you really do think you shouldn't have done, that really have been injurious to somebody else. And I'm not sure whether I want to say those are the same thing or not, that guilt is always interpersonal. I suggested that it's not always interpersonal, at least not unless you're counting ego ideals as interpersonal. So these are the questions that are in my mind about guilt, the relationship between the feeling and the state, what the state is, whether or not it necessarily involves other people. And I now open the floor to our panelists.
You may just want to say who is who, I think.
Let me see if I can. Michael Eigen, who is a psychoanalyst, the author of 15 books. Donald Carveth, who is a psychoanalyst and a sociologist, professor of sociology. Michael Lewis, who is psychoanalyst.
Nope.
Would you?
No, I'm not.
No.
Pardon me?
No, I'm not a psychoanalyst.
Developmental? No.
I'm a research scientist.
A research scientist.
So I'm going to bring that perspective to it.
Good. And Jay Greenberg, who is a psychoanalyst and the author also of many books. So I think not quite 15. Nobody can match that, Michael.
There'll be 3 books from this meeting.
Well, I think in the way that you laid out the problem, Marcia, that it raised a question for me about a distinction between feeling guilty and feeling bad about something that you've done that I think might help to sharpen what we mean when we talk about guilt. Mm-hmm. If you hurt somebody accidentally, you're probably not. Guilt is probably not warranted in that kind of situation, but you are going to feel bad, and you should feel bad. But it's not necessarily a guilty feeling. So that there seems to be some connection between guilt and intention that's implied in the concept, or guilt and a sense, an acceptance of agency for the act that you've committed. So I think we have to separate guilty feelings from other bad feelings about things that you've participated in or done.
That's not quite the same as shame either.
Well, that's another. I was holding that for later because there is a very important distinction. I think some of what you said about failure to live up to an ego ideal, most people these days would talk about in terms of shame rather than in terms of guilt. A failure to act in a certain way is usually described as shame, or a failure to act according to a certain standard, whether it's an internal standard or an externally imposed standard.
Mm-hmm. Well,
okay.
I think the way, obviously, we frame things will influence our discussion. So I want to frame it slightly different. And I want to do so because I'm not an analyst, although I was analyzed. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, but I don't do clinical work. I study the phenomena of emotion in the laboratory. And so I want to frame it, I want to come at it this way, because probably for at least 100 years, we've been asking questions, what are these things? And in roundtables or in our own writing, we use words and we have no way of proving it. And so I think one of the things we have to ask at some point would be about feelings in general, or emotions, about the self-conscious emotions, because it has been dealt with. Darwin spent a lot of time talking about it, and in particular then try to see, let's say, some difference between shame and guilt, which you brought up, which I think is very important. But more importantly, how would we go about finding out rather than talking about it? Because if you do a survey, and if we did it in this group, and we asked people to define shame and define guilt, we would, as the announcement said, we would have great difficulty. We all have different senses. Your analyst had a different sense. My analyst had a different sense than certainly what I think of it now. So I think somewhere in our discussion, if we truly want to move ahead, we have to not only try to find words, but how would we prove those? What constitutes proof that this is this thing and not some other thing? And I would hope in the evening, now that's my perspective because that's what I do. I try to do experiments and try to do that. But I would hope in the evening that we would spend some attention on not offering simply what we each think it might mean, but also to ask the question, as you started to parse it, what are those pieces, and how would we go about saying one is necessary or not necessary for guilt or for shame or for different kinds of guilt or whatever we might do.
Well, one way of addressing it may not be the way that you have in mind, but one way would be to say, by their fruits ye shall know them. That is, to make some of these distinctions in terms of the kinds of consequences or the kinds of actions that they lead to. I think that another approach is, of course, just to study the way different psychoanalytic traditions have used these words. When Freud used the word guilt, he usually had self-punishment in mind. In fact, he equated the unconscious sense of guilt with the unconscious need for punishment. I think that was an unfortunate equation because it distracted our attention from the ways in which the unconscious need for punishment, or even the conscious need for punishment, often serves as a defense against guilt. The Kleinian tradition always seems to have had a very different sense of what guilt involves. Guilt for the Kleinians is depressive anxiety, which is the same thing as what Winnicott called the capacity for concern. So in the Kleinian tradition, guilt is about concern for the object. Therefore, guilt is associated with love. It's associated with eros. Persecutory anxiety, as opposed to depressive anxiety, is all about self-torment and about self-punishment, and leads to what Freud called moral masochism, all of the strategies of self-torment and self-torture. So on the one hand, we've got the punitive superego, which is busy attacking us, which is all about aggression turned against the self, resulting in self-flagellation. And on the other hand, we've got depressive anxiety, which reflects concern for the object. So we do something that hurts someone, and it seems that we have two options. We can either flagellate ourselves, or we can go and bandage. And very often we flagellate ourselves instead of bandaging. And so I think we've got one way of trying to get at these distinctions is to look at these behavioral differences. Yeah.
Michael, I'm just wondering what you mean by proof. Proof for what you're thinking of? Proof for what guilt is?
Let me take the word proof back, and I agree with you in what you're about to say.
You do?
Because there are all sorts of proof, and it's presumptuous of me to try to suggest that there was only one way to prove.
Well, I didn't know what you were proving.
Well,
more the object.
For example, let's pick up on what was just said, which I think is important. One is to look at certain events and look at the consequences. What are the behaviors? Another is to look at events and see and to observe different kinds of events. Can we create a classificatory system? Indeed, we have. It exists. Although I only represent a part of it, I represent some part of it, which has very different definitions of guilt and shame that are much more both cognitive and attributional, that have a very strong feeling sense, that is something other than a cognitive, that are looking for causes and looking for consequences. So if I might give you a really I study infants and young children and their parents. So here's a little study with a 3-year-old. You take a 3-year-old and you observe it. You put it in a room and you give it a doll to play with or a toy to play with. And unbeknownst to the child, the toy falls apart as they're playing with it. It was designed to do this. And it falls apart. And what you see are 3 general types of behavior to that event. One, child simply ignores what happens and goes about doing something else. In another case, the child collapses in what we would describe as a kind of shame-like. And in the third case, the child tries to repair, which, interestingly enough, we've already started to touch on reparation and ego, and the collapse of the ego ideal, which I assume. I think I understand. So, fundamentally, you have a situation, and you have different kinds of behavior, and it's in a 3-year-old. So how are we to understand that? How are we to explain that? What would be another way of going about this might be, well, let's take that situation. Let's say the observation that I've just given is valid for the most part, and now let's ask, under that, how do we understand that? How should we come to understand it? 3 is particularly important because it turns out that from Darwin till present, the emergence of these kinds of emotion, unlike the earlier emotions, which you can see in early infancy, these self-conscious emotions emerge at about 3 years of age, not at 6 and not later, but they emerge. And that's now pretty well agreed in a certain part of the thinking world. So that's another way, perhaps, of going about it, rather than talking about what this person thought, what this person thought. It's another tradition. It's another way of getting coherence and understanding. But I don't know where it ultimately takes us. And while I agree with you, I don't think brain behavior yet is connected to these complex emotions. We're actually starting to do it, and one is beginning to see. So is there a different part of the brain that lights up when you have a task or you're doing something and a failure occurs? And how do we come to understand that? And I guess I'm a little impatient from the point of view that we could walk out and know what everyone thought about it, but not know much more, and not know how to go about knowing more. That's what I really meant by proof. I'm sorry, I'm talking
Very interesting study of your 3-year-old. That's fascinating.
And so proof is not proof in that sense. I meant trying to find coherences around which we could all agree. I mean, another roundtable might well be to bring in some videotapes, and it could be in any situation in which. And now, how are we going to explain that? And given your explanation versus my explanation, how might we see which one actually fits better?
I'm consumed with curiosity. I think I understand the kid that collapses in shame, and I think I understand the kid who tries to fix it. I'm interested in the kid who's indifferent.
Actually, Jay actually mentioned it because responsibility turns out to be an extraordinarily.
I was going to make the guess that's what was involved. That it has to do with different reactions to feeling responsible and different degrees to which each kid already by 3 was feeling responsible for what happened. Now, I think one thing that I would want to build on in that idea is the centrality of guilt in Freud's psychoanalysis as a kind of key affect in the neuroses, along with anxiety. It certainly is the sort of causal emotion that drives so many neurotic phenomena, whether it's...
he also called it a kind of anxiety. He called it superego
anxiety. But it's a specific kind of anxiety that's behind negative therapeutic reaction. It's behind the criminals from a sense of guilt. It's behind those wrecked by success. It's it's behind all sorts of phenomena that emerge in terms of self-defeating behavior, and that he presumed to be, I think, a reaction that people have to their feelings of responsibility and agency, and to taking on the sense that they are the cause of whatever's happened, which goes back to, I think, a kind of childhood omnipotence and sense of a sort of grandiose sense of responsibility for everything. That guilt would be the sort of signal affect of that early experience. So that I think the fact that you go back to the 3-year-old who's kind of at the height of feeling responsible for whatever happened, and it sounds to me like what you're describing is 3 different ways of coping with the experience, which we see in all our patients. I mean, there's some who go on oblivious, there are some who collapse, and there are some who might try to fix it.
The guilt that comes with that sense of omnipotence you were just talking about is, I think, one of the things my analyst meant by the wrong kinds of guilt.
Well, you know, it certainly is the kind of guilt that Freud seems to have stressed.
Yeah.
Because he insisted on our own agency, our own responsibility for whatever happened. You know, we are the agents of all our experience. We bring about the events of our lives. We're the exclusive agents of the events of our lives, and so when that makes us prone to feeling guilty. I mean, what happened to Oedipus happened because he had an Oedipus complex.
But there's also spread, a contagion, that what happened to Oedipus also happened to the state, so that the state was guilty. In the Bible, often what happens to a person or a state or a nation happens to the earth, so that the earth is filled with guilt, or to someone's house. A house could have a disease because of guilt in the Bible. So there's a notion that I meditate a lot on, that I got from Bion, that guilt precedes us. Guilt is like, so to speak, it's sort of like part of the psychical, is part of the radioactive background of the psyche. It's part of something that takes on configurations in life. Bion talks about that this guilt can be so to speak, pervasive in the background that we do things to configure it. Like if I don't know why I'm guilty, like Kafkaesque. He talks about the father, of course, the father guilt. But if his writings are more objectless guilt, or more objectless guilt, more conceptless guilt, it's just like guilt as an atmospheric condition that he breathes, that he lives, that permeates his skin, and that he can't get away from. That's almost a condition of his being or not being. And it's so that Bion points out that some people would go as far as murdering someone in order to say, that's what I feel guilty for. I pin it on that. I did it. And I don't know how far to go. I'm just saying, but kind of I can get kind of nutty, mad logic. Because today I woke up saying to my wife, she looked at me weird, don't say that tonight. Don't say it tonight. I just woke up saying, I killed Socrates. I killed Socrates. I killed Socrates. And and all it's a kind of psycho thinking. There's a lot of different kinds of psychotic logic, a lot of different kinds of mad logic. This is just a little piece of one kind of mad logic. It's sort of like all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Bion does a riff on this in one of his books. But, suppose I don't know that all men are mortal. Suppose I really don't know that. I'm not convinced of it. And I had to go so far as to kill Socrates to find out if death was real. And I sneaked up behind him early this morning before dawn. And I grabbed him from behind. I strangled him. I got him with a knife. I beat him up. And I'm not gonna, I can go on and on with what happened. I'm going to spare you for now, anyway. But I just want to say, he died. So death was real. Of course, this thing, I put this in brackets. I don't know whether we'll come back to it or not. Mentally, spiritually, he'll never die. He can't die. Because I'm impregnated with Socratic thinking. I'm impregnated with Platonic Socratic thinking, not only with thinking, but with an attitude, with an attitude toward truth, with an attitude toward searching, an attitude for looking for goodness, justice, and truth, whatever anyone thinks about them. It's a search, it's an internal search. So Socrates doesn't, it's sort of like what happens with a criminal, an actual murderer. He thinks he actually killed the person until they come back in their dreams. They succeeded in killing the body, but didn't succeed in killing the actual mental being of the person inside them. And Socrates has, so to speak, impregnated all of us. We're all impregnated with Socratic thinking, all of us. It was the Socratic attitude. But he's dead, and I killed him. And an unsuccessful murder. I murdered his body, but not his ideas. And what we've seen, for me anyway, in the last 5 odd years, is someone trying to murder ideas. An administration in our country in which thinking is, one attempts to murder thinking. And will it be successful? I wonder. I don't know. But in any case, since I've now proved that death exists in some form, there's a further step and I did it, so I know it. I know it exists. I found out for myself and my own being, my own private being. Is death real? Is death real? Yes, it is.
Well, to come back to your initial point, which I thought was an interesting one, I took you to be.
And the others are uninteresting. It's good you stopped me, because but let me just one little tidbit, then just a little.
I was performing my moderator's role.
I know. Shut me up, right?
Go ahead.
Just one little bit. I promise that now that I found out that I murdered Socrates, that I did it. All of a sudden, the truth of the syllogism, because his thinking is alive in me, the truth of the syllogism that he probably didn't make up, of course, because he couldn't have. But the truth of the syllogism suddenly hits me. And I think, but all men are mortal, all men die. Socrates probably, would have died whether I killed him or not. So there's a sense in which my guilt suddenly gets somewhat alleviated, because though I killed him, I suddenly realized, my God, there's such a thing as objective reality. Hard for you to believe that I think that. But there is such a thing as objective reality, and in that reality, I had nothing to do with his death. I'm just imagining it. It's my imaginative mind, and an adventure of my imagination that I woke up this morning thinking I killed Socrates, when now I realize, oh my God, all men are mortal. I didn't bring death into the world. It wasn't my fault in the Garden of Eden to do something bad and create death. I thought I created all the death in the world. And that's what the myth says, what the story says, that the man and the woman and the serpent created death. They made death happen. So I've been feeling guilty for all these years until this morning, thinking I created death, and suddenly it dawns on me that death has a life of its own. It's a little tiny bit guilt relieving.
Socrates, Philoctetes.
Say that again?
Socrates, Philoctetes.
Yes. I like it.
Do with it what you will.
Let it do.
Can I offer a proposition that's open for certainly discussion, but it might be useful? The tradition of studying emotions has come from two major sources, at least in modern Western thought. It's come from studying pathology, and it grows out of Darwin's interest in emotions and evolution. And they are very different traditions. So the proposition I'd like to just throw out is that guilt and shame and humiliation and pride and hubris are all human emotions. We all have them, and that it is the amount and how they are used where the pathology is. That guilt and shame are not pathological emotions. It's going back to the point I think you were making, which I thought was wonderful, namely states versus instances. These emotions may be adaptive responses to particular situations. That was Darwin's idea. And that the states of these is where the pathology might be, not in the emotions themselves. That's the...
Can I address that? Because I think that guilt is a more mature emotion than shame, but I need to be clear what I mean by guilt. I mean the capacity for concern. I mean the concern that drives towards reparation, the kid who wants to repair the doll. I think mature people experience both shame and guilt, but there are some people who can't experience guilt in the sense of concern. They can experience only shame. And I mean, in Kleinian terms, that's fixation in a paranoid schizoid position. That's a narcissistic position. It's all about me. It's all about my shame. What good is that to the person I've injured? Zero. Whereas some people, I'm interested in a transition point where a person who's growing psychologically comes to be able to begin to be ashamed of the fact that he can't feel guilt. That's interesting. That's an interesting transitional point when you start to feel ashamed of the fact that you have trouble feeling guilt. I think we're at the edge of the depressive position, and there's movement happening at that point. I really think, I mean, I realize I'm making a value judgment here. I think guilt is a good thing. I think Freud made a fundamental mistake when in Civilization and Its Discontents, he thought that the problem of civilization was that in order to live in a civilized society, we have to inhibit our antisocial drives, and not too many people have much capacity for conscious suppression without self-deception, and not too many people are blessed with enough talent for sublimation, so there's going to be a lot of repression. And then there's the return of the repressed aggression, which is taken over by the superego and leads to self-torment. But that's not guilt. The problem of civilization is the building up of self-torment, the building up of shame, the building up of self-damaging patterns. The way out of this is through a greater capacity to feel guilt, not as self-attack, but guilt as concern leading to creative, constructive, reparative activity. That's the solution to the problem of civilization. It's not the problem. So I'm making a value judgment, obviously. Guilt, good, as far as I'm concerned. But we live in a culture in which guilt has gotten a bad name because the culture has confused guilt with what Freud mostly thought it was, self-punishment.
You have to
your point about Freud, I think, is part of another point about civilization's discontents, which is that Freud derives guilt from aggression, back inwards, whereas the kind of guilt you're talking about, and I would agree with you, and I think of exactly. And here it seems to me Klein is righter than Freud, because Klein also sees love twisted, tortured, etc. But love is the basis for guilt, and that seems to me right.
And it's a very different understanding, isn't it? I agree with you about Klein.
It's a very different understanding.
Very different understanding.
I don't want to sign on too quickly to your equation of guilt and concern.
Okay.
Because I think that one can feel concern without guilt, and one can also feel guilt without concern.
Yeah.
So
when you say concern without guilt, can you tell me what that looks like? Because what would concern without guilt?
Altruistic feelings without a sense of responsibility.
Oh, I see. Altruistic concern without
you're concerned though you haven't done anything wrong.
Okay.
You have to have the responsibility.
I am concerned about what has been wrought in Iraq.
Right.
but I don't feel guilty about it.
Okay, well then, would you accept the modification then? There's lots of concern that isn't guilt, but what I've essentially been arguing is to try to, and of course we can define terms any way we want, it's a matter of consensual agreement, but what I've been pushing is the idea that we ought to stop confusing guilt with self-attack, and we ought to reserve the term guilt for concern leading to reparation. Now, I could still make that argument and still acknowledge your point that not all concern is guilt, but I would want to say, let's call guilt concern.
I'd like to just contextualize it a little bit in terms of we could be talking also, and necessarily have to talk about, as Marcia brought up and hinted at, brought up in the beginning with her analyst, different kinds of guilt, not just right or wrong guilt, or pathological or I don't even know what that means anymore, since so much of normal stuff is sick. So, but there's so many contexts in which different qualities of guilt play a role. It's not like a uniform thing. This is guilt. This is good guilt. This is bad guilt. It's much more. There's much more variability, nuance. There's qualities of guilt, and very often depending on inner and outer contexts. So the kind of guilt you're talking about is one we've had too little of in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
We've had a psychopathic-dominated nation in which guilt is on back burner, and not even shame is risen to. You know, when you look at what's been done in our government for 5 years, you wonder where's the shame and the guilt? It's not there. As long as I win, as long as I'm on top, as long as I get what I want, screw everybody. So there's a kind of a psychopathic elan, a psychopathic zeitgeist in certain portions of the land. So in that sense, the kind of Christian guilt you're talking about is lacking, and kind of ironically, in all these Christian-speaking ideologues, to some extent, Judeo-Christian speaking ideologues. Mm-hmm. So it's crazy. So I do very much value that piece of guilt that you're talking, or that quality of guilt, as long as it's put in a context. Because there is the self-punishment guilt. There really is, and there really is the objectless guilt. I'm guilty and I don't know why, that Kafka was trying to give expression to. All that's very real too.
And the guilt that Marcia was talking about, the guilt for failing to do something with our talents. The existentialist analysts got to that. Binswanger, Medard Boss, these people, Irvin Yalom, existential guilt, ontological guilt, in which I'm failing myself, not just hurting others.
Why would you assume that somehow guilt is good and shame is bad? From an evolutionary point of view, one might argue that if that were the case, why should we all have shame now? Let me suggest that shame is extraordinarily important, and it picks up what Michael is talking about. It is, you don't want to live in a society where there is no shame. Forget about guilt. Shame has the property of, it's so powerful and so negative, it's so destructive to the self, however you may want to describe that in your terms, that in fact it stops you from doing something. That is, the argument is made that an Eichmann could be guilty. Yes, I was a good father, I'm a good card player, I have good friends. Yeah, I put people in cattle cars and so on. But shame, where the self is damaged, that from an evolutionary point of view, should actually have an advantage because it stops you from doing it.
Well, I'm not...
You really have to pay attention, because if you look at shame, actually in clinical cases, and I've done this with
I'm ashamed
with colleagues,
of myself,
you can actually see the body collapse. You can watch what happens to language. I mean, there is a real impact on it, and I would argue the proposition would be that, yes, if that's all you've got, that is the pathology that we need to help about. But I wouldn't want to live in a society in which people are not truly shamed about some of the things they do.
I think one reason that psychoanalysis historically has tended to consider guilt the more mature emotion is that guilt is understood to be an internal process, whereas shame is understood to have an external referent. I'm failing to perform up to some standard that's set out there. And I think if you look at, well, a couple of thoughts. One is the distinction that anthropologists have made between guilt and shame cultures, Ruth Benedict in particular, where guilt cultures are seen as sort of embracing internal regulation, whereas shame cultures are seen as relying more on external societal regulation. And of course, psychoanalysts tend to think that what's internalized is more mature.
Well, it's more mature also in another way, that just cognitively one doesn't have the idea of one's own values and one's own standards. That comes later developmentally than what shame requires.
We get into trouble with those. And Freud got into trouble because the more mature, men had it more. In fact, women express more shame than men, and they do so, it appears to be, because they are willing to take responsibility for their failure. And one of the things that men do in general is, and anyone married or living with a man or a woman knows, there are actually couple dynamics. This, when the man is less likely, and I'm not talking about pathological cases. I'm talking about because I don't approach it that way. So and maybe it's different in another approach. But certainly, if you look at the normative data, men are less likely to take responsibility for failure than are women, and women are more likely to express shame than men. And Freud talked about it. He talked about it as genital insufficiency. And you go for an audience of younger people, and you talk about genital insufficiency as the reason why women don't feel shame, this immature emotion, where men feel this mature emotion, and you will be booed right out. I think it is. I think we make a mistake in saying one is somehow better or worse. I think we have to define it by situation, not in the pathology case. I can't address that. I certainly don't. I don't experience it, and I don't know enough about it.
Let me say some negative things about shame. First of all, I think we need to make some distinctions about the idea of taking responsibility. I mean, I agree. The person who feels shame is in one sense taking responsibility, saying that I've done something and I'm now suffused with shame. But are they taking responsibility? Are they so busy suffering their shame that they're not extending their responsibility to go and fix the thing that they've done that they're ashamed about? So that's a limited level of responsibility. I'm bad. I want more responsibility than I'm bad. Now, another negative thing I will say about shame is we have to look at the consequences of feeling intense states of shame. People hit the bottle. People take pills. People throw themselves into driven sexual enactments because they can't bear these horrible states of shame. And so we see a lot of destructive behavior that is driven by a need to soothe shame. Whereas if instead of going into shame, the person had gone into guilt as concern and had gone out and fixed the situation, they would get some positive self-esteem coming back to them and feel better about themselves and not need to resort to substances or whatever it is they're resorting to soothe the shame.
I really have a hard time breaking things up that way. this is against my nature to do it, but if I had to, I'd like to be inclusive, because I'm sure both shame and guilt, so to speak, if you use these terms, to be less mature shame or less healthy shame, and more healthy shame and more mature shame, and to be a scale of guilts too, better and worse guilts, so to speak, higher and lower guilts, so that shame and guilt both would have a continuum, or a biography, or a structural continuum between more primitive, self-centered, narcissistic-oriented, no other shame, and shame. Because I find that if I'm ashamed of something, it sensitizes me. It sensitizes me to a feeling that the other person, it connects me with the other. I feel a connection with the other person. I feel, what if I'm ashamed of myself for doing that? It's not like you've shamed me. It's I've done something to you and I'm ashamed of it, or I've done something to you. It's like there are areas, there are contexts in which fear, shame, and guilt co-sponsor each other and lead to a struggle with oneself to become a better person.
But couldn't one say that what you're saying is that shame sensitizes you to your need to feel guilt?
No, I don't play that game. I feel that shame can sensitize me to caring, to trying to be a better person and care for others better.
Well, that's what I mean by guilt, is the effort to be a better person and to care for people better.
You've defined it one way. I would see that it could happen with shame, and I could see it happening with guilt and with fear, too. Mm-hmm. I don't think that these things are, this is the good one and this is the bad one, or this is the better, mature one, this is the primitive one. I think guilt can be terribly, terribly, horribly primitive, and shame likewise, and fear likewise, and they both could be extremely, extremely socially and personally sensitizing. So it's not a bifurcation, not a one or the other thing. I think you shut me up, Marcia, at any time.
You don't shut up very well.
I feel ashamed.
No, you don't.
Is my face red? It feels red. My hands are red.
May I recommend guilt?
Maybe I can achieve that. I can reach for that. I'm going to go uphill. It's an uphill climb, but I'll get there. There's a functional. I don't always see it this way, but just for the moment, for the evening, there's a kind of functional level of guilt, shame, fear, a kind of mystical level, and I don't know what to call the third one. I don't know. I'm going to just call it transcendent, because I don't have a better word at the moment. The functional level is what I call the wheelbarrow image. Probably got it from Solomon Ash when I was a graduate student. But in the wheelbarrow, you have like two people. So you put one person on each handle, and they have to go from here to there. And they have to feel what the other person is doing in order to go from here to there. They have to be sensitive to the movements, to the nuances. Say they have to negotiate going over tough terrain where there are rocks, or maybe there's a ditch or something. And the two of them have to balance the wheelbarrow, or whatever precious load is in the wheelbarrow get lost, assuming it's not just manure now, but they have to get from here to there. And I think fear, guilt, and shame do that. They're sensitive to their wheelbarrow emotion. They're sensitive. You have to work together. They're socially binding, socially sensitizing emotions in which you have to take the other's movements into account. And they're self-corrective. You have to keep, in this wheelbarrow notion, you have to keep on correcting your own motions in order to be able to coordinate with the other person as you're moving the wheelbarrow together to get from here to there. Make-believe wheelbarrow, say a society or a family or a couple, or us tonight. And fear and guilt and shame, in better and worse ways, any of them can are part of what we modulate our social pods, our social feelers. They're intrinsic to our social feelers, and we're deficient without them.
You know, I want to clarify something I said a minute ago about guilt as more mature. I didn't mean better or worse. I was making strictly a conceptual point, and that is that most emotions, and guilt certainly is one of them, have a heavy cognitive component. That is, you don't even know whether somebody is feeling guilt until you can say something about what you think the beliefs and desires are that he has to have in order for guilt even to be an attributable emotion to him, which is why that was the purport of my question to you in the beginning. What you want to prove about what, because it seems to me you can't prove anything about what guilt is until you know, first of all, what you're looking for. What do you mean by guilt? So I only meant that I think developmentally that the concept of, I think we would all agree that you can't be feeling guilt per se unless you're feeling that you've done something wrong by your own standards.
I don't agree with that.
Oh, okay, but let me finish the point. Let me finish the point. If that is the case, then you would have to have a concept of your own standards in order to be able to be feeling guilty to begin with. And I think that's something that children arrive at later than they arrive at the idea of oneself.
It's not the case.
It's not the case.
There are now enough studies to say. Well, there are a couple of things. One, more mature or not, of course, has certain kinds of moral implication.
Which I was trying to free it from.
And I think we have to be careful about that. I think we all agree to that. For example, the evidence seems to be, whatever that evidence might be, and obviously I'm not going to go into detail, but that shame and guilt emerge at the same time in children. And it emerges when, in fact, they start to have standards and they have the sense of responsibility. So, for example, if you can show that 3-year-olds, if you give them an easy task and they succeed, they show much less pride than if you give them a difficult task and they succeed.
But a child who wets its pants often feels something that certainly looks like shame.
Wetting pants.
That looks like shame, though, so I do want to talk about
it. Wetting pants, it could look like anything. It could look like fear. It could look like, we can make it anything we want. We have to agree that, and so what I'm saying is we can agree on certain things. We do know what pride looks like. And I take pride, just to break our set for a minute, because pride fits into the same self-conscious emotions. You need to have responsibility. If you win the lottery, you're awful happy, but you're not proud.
I don't think you need a sense of responsibility to feel shame. That was my point.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think you do.
Well, okay.
So,
Alrighty. Well, that's right. So now,
I think most
we have disagreement. But
I think most psychoanalysts
find out about this.
I think most psychoanalysts would say, and I'd be interested in your the research findings on. I think most psychoanalysts would say that shame is interpersonally induced from a very early stage, in contrast to guilt, which is more of an internalized emotion. Now, whether that bears up to the research findings or not, I don't know. But I would say that it's a pretty widely held point of view in our clinical work and also in our theoretical structure.
Our problem, which was addressed to begin with in the announcement, and you introduced it as well. Our problem is, how do we sort of find out these things? We've been going at it a while. So are there behaviors? If we agree reparation is a good kind of measure, and we're interested, we can see in those 3-year-olds, those kids who try to repair, if we say that body collapse is a shame, that and it's, they're very dramatic if you see these videotapes, and these are normal kids. They're coming in not because there's pathology. presumably. So what we have to do is to say, well, what are the behaviors if we want to parse it up? Michael is saying, well, it's very complex and there are little bits of each of them, and maybe parsing isn't a good idea, and that may be the case. I can't argue that. It's a reasonable proposition. But for me, at least, if I want to study this and study the development of it, which is indeed what I try to do, not from a pathological, I need certain agreements. If can we agree that the child who, when something goes wrong, tries to fix it, that is reparation, is that going to be different?
Could also be that he's more of a problem solver. He feels his juices. His juice. I like to figure out how. I like to.
Well, then let's throw problem solving into our definition of guilt and shame. That's okay. We can do that.
Collapser may not be shame so much as a kind of certain kind of sense of helplessness in face of an awesome task that's bewildering and befuddling. May or may not be shame. Shame may play a secondary role to the sense of I can't do it.
The sense of helplessness could be linked to the idea of not having confidence in one's reparative powers. Which is one of the things that...
or interest in the world, such that I am interested in how it works. Look, how did that happen? Let me see if I can work it out. I have an older kid. I don't know if he's powered by guilt or shame or fear more. I don't know. But he's a problem solver. And he is intrigued by, he's challenged by, he's turned on by things that go wrong. And he wants to see what he can do with them. And I don't know whether it's reparation or whether it's something more, I wouldn't call it cognitive. It's not the right thing. It's a hungry curiosity about how things work, a passion about how things work. And some people have more of it. Some people have less of it.
One thing strikes me as very important, though, in terms of your kind of research on guilt. I mean, it's crucial to distinguish guilt A from guilt B, if we want to use the word to cover both. I mean, because the kind of guilt that involves intense self-attack, I would assume, is going to light up a different part of the brain than the kind of guilt that involves the mature cognitive processing that involves empathy, that involves taking the role of the other and imagining how it must feel for that other to have received the blow that I just dealt. I mean, that is a very different kettle of fish, isn't it, altogether? And yet both of those things go by the same word, guilt. Our discourse is so confused when we use one word to describe such radically different things as primitive self-attacking behavior, as opposed to the ability to take the role of the other and imagine how the other feels. I mean, man, that's a very different phenomenon.
Should I make things worse? Can I say a word about mystical guilt? No. Someone said no. Someone said yes. That's the way it works. Some people say yes, some people say no. I'm thinking of Wittgenstein, and who was one of the most guilty people who must have lived that I ever heard of. And he felt guilty about almost everything. And it got sort of encapsulated in his sense of sin. And he's a terrific example, whatever the residues of guilt were through his life and his inhibitions and all the rest. But one thing that I've always been impressed by, turned on by, a positive thing, I think, is the intensity of his guilt when he was really in it, really in his sinful nature or whatever, his hopeless sinful nature. And he just went farther and farther into this pure intensity, the pure micro world of guilt, this pure, and it got revved up and revved up. What happened is sort of like a wormhole in, the psyche gets perforated by this intensity. The psyche gets perforated, and like a wormhole opens up, and when he emerges, he comes out in a very different place. It's not that the guilt is secondary now, and what's primary is something, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it grace. Let's call it light. Let's call it God. That sticking more and more and more, focusing on this guilt feeling, suddenly does something to the psyche, does something to the spirit. And it takes one to another place entirely that one couldn't have gotten there without some sort of vehicle like this.
Do you know Keith Hartman's recent book on John Wesley and Methodism? It's a psychoanalytic study. It's just been published. I supervised his PhD thesis. It's exactly about this. Wesley, Methodism as a practice, heaped guilt on the person, and they felt more and more sinful, and then it seemed to trigger this breakthrough, and there would be a conversion experience. I mean, a Kleinian would suspect that this is a manic defense against unbearable, I wouldn't call that guilt, unbearable self-torment and self-loathing triggering a manic defense, which then is given a religious definition. But
it could be that.
But his book is all about what you're describing.
It could be a manic defense, but it could be something more interesting. I wouldn't want to sew it up so quickly. I'd like to leave it open. But do you know that...
I like sewing things up. You like leaving them
open.
I know that.
But maybe we'll like each other anyway.
Sure.
We're on the same earth, the same mind, different manifestations of the one mind.
Exactly.
So you may or may not know that Winnicott's background was Wesleyan.
I did not. I knew it was Christian. I didn't know it was
Wesleyan. And I was thinking, when Jay was talking before, for some reason it triggered, in terms of early worlds, one of Winnicott's descriptions of early world, in one of his passages, he talks about two different worlds a child can be born into. Two different worlds a child can be born to. He pictures an infant. This is an imagination, a thought experiment. Only for him, he felt it was realized concretely when he was a pediatrician. He saw this when he was a pediatrician, but he didn't exactly have a frame of reference for it, which he got later on. And he pictured these two different worlds that an infant could be born in. His example, in one world, there's a baby who kicks the mother, or kicks the mother's breast. And the mother doesn't especially like to get hurt or pained by the baby, but she takes pleasure in the baby's kicking, in the baby's aliveness, She takes precautions so she won't get hurt, but at the same time there's an inner rejoicing at the baby has oomph, is alive, and is kicking, alive and kicking. And he pictures a second situation that you're born into, you could be born into, where the baby kicks the mother, and the mother recoils in a kind of pain, which he then puts on like a moralistic cover, a guilt or shaming or fear cover, where, the infant's bad for doing it. The infant gets an immediate transmission. It's not an intellect. It's an immediate through and through my being transmission of being bad for doing that. That his alive feeling isn't good. His alive feeling causes. It's not all rational like that.
That story, which I, having been stepped on in various places by children of various ages myself, resonates.
Ditto. It's his 30-year-old, just happened yesterday.
But it reminds me of your comment that death has a life of its own, and that the mother has a life of her own, and that the definition of the event is co-constructed between the child or the young adult, in my case, and the parent. So that the idea that the experience is encoded as a guilty one, and that the responsibility for causing what happened is the child, sort of eliminates the environmental reaction, the parental reaction. And I think that that's something that psychoanalysis has a tendency to do, Freudian psychoanalysis in particular.
So are you saying then that the environmental reaction, which in this case was a recoil, a moralistic recoil,
is this growth and expansiveness and aliveness and vitality? Or is it aggression?
Is it what?
Or is it growth and aliveness and vitality?
Yes.
Which is something to celebrate, or is it aggression, which is something to feel guilty about?
It could be either.
That is something.
Right.
That's something that.
It could be either, but it could become a more malignant motivation depending on the reaction to it. Also.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's where death has a life of its own. The mother who is kicked has a life of her own.
Yes.
And I think that children tend to take on, tend to create a meaning of an event that's in part contingent on the reaction
it's
that the event, but in the experience of guilt, they make it entirely their own.
I don't believe that. Temporarily or on and off, or I think that we're so intertwined. I think we're so intertwined and so interreactive that there's going to be part of the other in me encoded into that experience. There's going to be the other's face, the look that made me recoil.
But then who's responsible for that look?
Oh, well, I am.
I think
at
that
that
the
moment,
child.
I am responsible.
And
I did it. I killed Socrates.
Yes. And it took you a very long time to work your way out of that.
That's right.
And to work your way out of it, you had to realize that death has a life of its own.
You have to be looked at some other way.
I think sometimes that psychoanalysis doesn't help us to decenter from what's really a kind of grandiose starting point.
Because of the grandiose analyst, yes.
You seem to be you're addressing the idea that Fairbairn got at with his idea of what he called the moral defense, where the person becomes filled with guilt in an omnipotent way. They're taking responsibility, and this is a defense. I think it's unfortunate that this would be called guilt, because it bears no relation to what I mean by guilt as concern. But it's self-blame. The child blames himself, and he does so defensively. Parents didn't love me, it's because I'm bad. Far better for me to think that I'm bad, because if I hadn't been bad, then they would have been loving. I don't have to see myself as traumatically victimized by parents who just were incapable of love. Now, to me, that's very much a spurious guilt. That's a real thing. We see that in our consulting rooms all of the time. Spurious guilt. I don't think that's guilt. I don't want to call that guilt. I see it all the time. It's an omnipotent defense. Fairbairn associated it with guilt. A lot of us do talk about that as guilt, but I think it's not guilt. I think it's self-blame, it's self-attack.
Well, it's an omnipotent defense against
trauma.
Well, against seeing the parent is not loving and is less than
oneself is helpless to do anything about that.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe some of us in the room have seen the New York magazine article that talked about Carolyn Dweck's work. It was in an issue or two past. Carolyn Dweck was a professor here at Columbia, and she's now out at Stanford, and she's very much interested in children's achievement and their failure, and is very much interested in what parents do. The article in the magazine, and indeed her work in professional journals that are reviewed, as well as her books, seem to indicate that parents who praise their children a great deal have children who get into trouble. And in fact, I've spent a considerable amount of time in Japan, and there's a big cultural difference between the Japanese and we. And the Japanese do not praise their children. and we do a great deal of praise. So I just want to throw that out because I don't know how we're going to integrate that into this good parenting and bad parenting and what that means and what the child senses or feels. But it's counterintuitive in a certain sense. Here are parents who do a great deal. You've done a great job, and I'm really proud of you, and so on. And these kids get into trouble. And I mean, they're normative again. It's not coming at it from a psychotherapeutic sort of way. It's not coming out of it from abnormal. And it may not be applicable to issues of treatment, but it certainly has to make us pause for a moment and say, why in the world would that be? Now, we can say it's not really praise, or we can sort of find some way to worm our way out of it. But what if, in fact, it was? What if it was the case that when a parent says, that's really good, it's great, I'm really proud of you, that turns out to be the equivalent of, you disgust me, what an awful child you are. And it seems to have the same effect.
Shall we open this discussion to everyone, perhaps?
Well, I certainly didn't mean to conclude our discussion, but it's on my data, and it was just recently was in the magazine, so those of you have it.
That wasn't really what she said in the article. She said that kids who were very bright became afraid that they would then fail because they were so brilliant.
Well, I'm not going to discuss what she said in the article. In fact, that's what she says, but that's okay.
Yes.
I was, my understanding of shame is, and guilt is, and guilt is to do something in an action that you did. You feel guilty. Shame is you do something and you feel you're bad. The action is not bad. It's yourself. It's the core of your action. I think, I come from a very shame-based family, and both my parents were. And if it's hard for somebody to feel guilty, to feel correct something, to feel that comes at the core of who that person is. If I didn't have any shame and I do something, I'd say, okay, I'm guilty. That's charged. I'll fix it. But if I say something, if I do something, and I go, my God, that's just further proof that I'm just, it's a crap. And you just, and it's just pervades you. So to me, shame is incapacity more than guilt is. I think it's more like a grandiose. I think you said grandiose sense of responsibility.
Yes.
Unhealthy sense of responsibility because you are defective and not your action.
Right. But that is the problem. I mean, clinically, in terms of clinical technique, one of the dilemmas that the analyst has with certain types of patients is that he can't address any badness in the patient. The patient can't tolerate any badness. And I think it's because the patient is still caught up in a good deal of splitting. I mean, a person who is caught in either or, I either have to be smelling like a rose, and the only alternative is to be worthless, evil, suffused with shame. I should be shot at dawn. So, I can't go there. So I have to constantly not be looking at my flaws because I can't remember my goodness when I'm looking at any badness. It's just like ink in the water, right? So one of the things I'm interested in is techniques. How do we help address this clinically? And Los Angeles analyst Desi Saffron-Girard, Kleinian analyst in LA, she's written very insightfully about this, and she talks about the importance of the analyst in the interpretations. First of all, stressing the patient's goodness, reminding the patient of their goodness, and then addressing this problem to try to help the patient remember both sides. Another technique that she advocates is to always frame the interpretation of the bad act as understandable in a sense, given where you're coming from, given the problems that you have, given the trauma that you've suffered. you do these things, and they're bad, and a big part of you knows they're bad, but we know where they're coming from. We're not talking about a bad seed. We're not talking about some old Kleinian notion of a primary envy or a primary human destructiveness. I mean, I think if you talk to patients in those kinds of ways, you can sometimes enhance their ability to get out of this splitting, whereby any flaw becomes a massive, unbearable flaw. You know? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yes. I was wondering if you could comment on how much your privileging of guilt over shame relies on an idea of an underlying core or substantial self that is static, and how much it also relies on an idea of a separation between internal and external experiences. If you agree that there's a relationship between those two things, three, I guess, do you think those are tenable philosophical positions after reading someone like Heidegger?
Now, what's the distinction you're making? I'm sorry, would you repeat it again?
Yes. If you privilege guilt over shame, it seems to me like you're saying, shame is bad because I am bad. To me, that seems to imply that you believe there's a core self that's substantial and does not change. So you're either all bad, sort of forever, or all good, sort of forever, as opposed to shame into changing who you are, and yourself is kind of like a storied process that reacts in front of this transformative power of shame, which I think is where you're coming from. If you also think that guilt is better than shame, but because it's internal, you're relying on a distinction between an internal private self that's separate from interpersonal phenomena and external reality that is outside of me, that's private subject. Now, if you agree that that's what it relies on, you don't have to agree, of course. Could you tell me why you don't?
But I don't think we are. I don't think any one of us wants to privilege guilt over shame.
Well, you seem to talk about it as a more mature.
I'm willing to plead guilty to privileging guilt over shame. I plead guilty to that charge.
But let me just clarify what I meant by maturity once again. By maturity, I don't mean that it's better.
You mean cognitive maturity?
I just mean it's cognitively more complex.
So I guess I'm speaking more to that.
I do agree that guilt is. Can we break your question down? The whole idea of a substantial self, it's not that I believe in a substantial self. My patients believe in a substantial self. So that when the patient is suffused with shame because he recognizes he's done something wrong, and instead of getting busy to repair it, he simply is consumed with what a useless, horrible human being he is, he believes in a substantial self. That's something that we then can proceed to analyze. It doesn't require me to believe
It's interesting, the question and where we float around is actually something that was originally the first thing. The state and the emotion itself, and unless we're prepared to make that distinction, which you're reiterating in some sense, we have a problem. You keep coming back to this guilt or shame-ridden person. Now that is a substantiation of this person as this thing, and no one is a thing.
The patients come to us believing that. That is what psychopathology is to a considerable degree.
No, it's part of what our theories are as well. So it's not only because we base our theories on what they're saying, as if somehow they may be representing reality. I mean, they may not.
I mean, a psychoanalytic theory gets caught up in the very...
Well, it's interesting because you can approach, as I tried to say, I think you can approach a problem from the pathology point of view of that, and you can approach it from a non-pathology, from the normative point of view. And I'm not sure, and I think most of our discussion, in part because I suspect most of the audience where we're having the meeting and the participants come at it more from a pathological point of view. This is what you're confronted with and have to deal with and try to help and so on. And I'm not sure those 2 points of view, well, what I am sure of is we got to do a lot more talking, those 2 points of view. But we're not talking about the shame, overwhelmed shame person. We're talking about, or we could, but we could just talk about shame. We could talk about an instant when all of us, well-adjusted, occasionally have a shame or occasionally have a guilt experience, and we can look at it in its normative sense. What are the properties? What are the cognitive prerequisites of it? What, including responsibility or being able to understand the world? So it seems to me that once we start talking about it in a pathological sense, that's where we get into what I think is the difficulty, or at least the strong position you're taking, namely one is mature or more mature or less mature, not from your point of view. So it seems to me that, yeah, you have a guilt experience, yeah, you have a shame experience, but you're not guilt-ridden and you're not shame-ridden. Human beings have these experiences.
Right, but I would still say that if you're a relatively mentally healthy person, and you've maybe been well analyzed, maybe many times, and you're functioning, and you have a shame experience. All I'm saying is that at the moment that you're having that shame experience, it's all about you.
You're inviting consolation for yourself.
And you're preoccupied with yourself. You're not thinking about other people at that moment. When you're feeling shame, all you're thinking, this is narcissism.
Right.
You're self-preoccupied at that moment.
I think you're really getting blurring that distinction between that I was talking about before, between guilt and concern. There's certainly a narcissistic guilt that is at least as self-absorbed as the narcissistic.
I wouldn't call it guilt. I would not. I would agree with you that it exists, but I would not want to call it guilt. I would want to make an argument.
There's object concern shame too.
Yes,
object concern shame.
Definitely.
Tell me about that. That's very interesting.
Yes, if I'm ashamed of something I did with my children, I try to make it, correct it.
You see, I would say your shame has led you into guilt, and that's why you're trying to.
I know you would say that, but you have to then listen to my experience, which you're not doing.
Okay.
Because it's not doing very well, so I would go to another analyst, Someone will hear me. But I want to just say that the one particular mode that shame would sensitize me to is not necessarily going out and making reparation. It's Yom Kippur, and or Rosh Hashanah, I'm now going to atone. Not necessarily, but atone in the sense of say, oh my God, this is not the kind of person I want to be. I don't want to be the kind of person that does these kinds of things to people. I want to somehow struggle with the thing that I'm ashamed of doing, and somehow do better, become fuller, become more cognizant, more feeling, more sensitized toward in a way toward the other, that I shouldn't be so ashamed of myself by who I am.
Yes.
Okay, I recently saw on a British women magazine the title, "Become Yourself, Only a Better One." Now, I think the second part, "only a better one," implies a certain feeling of, self-punishment, guilt, which would more go into, let's say, Lacanian reading of Freud's idea of superego. Superego would not only be self-punishing, guilt-producing agency, but also an agency which says, enjoy, but you will always fail. You should do it, but you will fail. That kind of an inner voice which tells you try, but nonetheless, you will not succeed. That's, I think, one very important point that Lacan makes about guilt. The other one is about rethinking Freud's idea of the primal core. Well, Lacan's idea is not that sons feel guilty after killing the father. They actually feel guilty because the father was already dead, in the meaning that he was powerless as an authority, which is a lot of hysterics would take on themselves the feeling of guilt in order to keep the authority somehow, at least temporarily, alive. Which brings me to my question. I teach psychoanalysis and law at the Cardozo Law School here, and what I try to teach my students, lawyers, is to understand the difference in the feelings of guilt that they will observe among their clients, let's say. And here I usually use the difference between the obsessional neurosis, hysteric, obsessional being extremely guilty, or neurotic usually claim that someone else is guilty, and also the difference how psychotic is in some way not guilty in that way as a neurotic is, but nonetheless has usually, let's say, at least some kind of a guilt, but guilt which is in a way kind of fixated guilt, where there are in a way no doubts. A person might kill because God told her to do it, she feels guilty, but in that kind of a different type of it. So my question is, how come that you didn't use any of those kind of differences, let's say, between neurosis, psychosis, and so on?
Well, I'm not going to be able to answer what you're saying entirely, but I just want to add that on a particular domain of the psychotic register, so to speak, everything, affect and attitudes tend to get infinitized. It's like we have an internal magnifying machine or a minifying machine that blows everything up or microscopes it. And one thing that I think that psychologic does, certain kind of mad logic does, is first of all there's a certain boundlessness to an affect or an attitude or an intentionality state. As, so to speak, my will fills the universe, or my feeling fills the. There's no. It's like everything is this, and it's like a totalization and everything, and it's like no room for another possibility, except of course in the psychotic. The psychotic is not, a psychotic person is not so simple, because the psychotic often is in doubt about his own experience. So like I am told by God to kill my sister, and I will do, and that, if I don't kill my sister, I will go to hell forever. And this is an infinite state. It's an infinite state, except for the fact that there's another qualifying infinite. Is this right? Is this right? What if I don't kill my sister? What if I don't kill my sister? And it's like doubt now fills the universe. It's sort of like a boundless doubt makes me helpless. So say if I'm a good catatonic, I might stay in an immobilized state for 15, 20 years, and I'd be going through this thing. Does God rule the universe? Does the devil rule the universe? Is murder the right thing? Is love the right thing? So I might be going through a cosmic crisis between good and evil. And it may take me 20 years something in me might snap, might figure out, might move in one direction or the other, in which case I might explode and kill someone. Or something might snap and say, oh my God, love is real, and not just a demonic God. There's different kinds of gods, and I've been trapped by a demonized God all this time, and now I see the loving God.
Michael, excuse me, let me just see if Van Belt has a response to this. Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to lose it that the psyche magnifies, infinitizes, and has a certain area of boundless in the psychotic register, and subjects affect and intentionality to this boundless totalization and boundless doubt.
I would agree with Michael about the totalizing quality of psychotic experience, but one can talk about it simply in terms of the degree of aggression that is turned against the self. In neurosis, it's a more moderate degree. The hostile superego condemns you, but it also lets you live. It's reasonable. It doesn't totalize. It sees degrees. The psychotic superego turns intense aggression against the self, and as Bion points out, it turns aggression against the thinking functions of the mind, and it fragments one's capacity to think. I'm not addressing the Lacanian points that you're making. I can't really address them. I don't know enough about Lacanian ideas to be able to do so.
You had sheeted over here too. Okay. Right.
It's just where remorse comes on this continuum. It would seem it's quite guilt-bound in the sense of quite specific. There's remorse for an action, but I'd just like to know in terms of this whole discussion.
They're essentially the same for Freud,
Right.
Though remorse is for something actually done. That would be, I think, the difference. But
But for instance, what Dr. Lewis was talking about, does the child feel remorse at the collapse of the object or frustration at the collapse of the object? And how can you tell what the qualitative aspect is?
The question of how to tell is, of course, central to making any progress.
well, you wouldn't. Let me just make a conceptual point. You wouldn't call it remorse unless you believed that he believed he was responsible for
Yes,
the
I know, but so
destruction.
I'm wondering where is remorse in all of this, and is it the non-infinite responses?
Do they interview the children in that?
A 3-year-old is not going to be a very good interviewee in terms of telling. And that's one of the interesting things, is that in fact you can't use the language between, but you have to look at their behavior in the context of situations which affords you some opportunity and limits you in some opportunity. We have many words, emotional words, and we can go around and we can get our opinion of them, but physicists don't go around asking one another what they think. And at some point, if we really want to move ourselves toward a science of treatment, toward a science of understanding this, we're going to have to do more than that. And that requires that we, one, agree to disagree, of course, but two, to agree that we have to start somewhere. We have to simply say, we have an enormous number of terms. Not all cultures have the same enormous array of terms. It turns out we have many more negative emotion terms than we have positive terms, and that does seem to be a universal. One would have to ask, why is that? Why do we have many more negative than positive terms? I mean, if you asked again in the normative sense, and now across culture, so you're starting to look at something that may be humankind, why is it that in languages, all languages, where we, for example, Italian, guilt and shame are just the opposite of what we're trying to get at. I mean, it's really, because one of my books was translated into Italian, and it was very difficult to, but the point is, we can ask all these terms. I don't know where we get and where we end up, and why I think it's very important to approach it in many different ways. We do need certain kinds of agreement. You asked about, how would you know, and can you inquire? That would be very interesting, but they're too young, so you can start. Would you like to talk? I'll stop. Go ahead. No, it's quite all right.
I was just, your question, I just was at a talk by a Buddhist monk where he was talking about the difference between guilt and remorse. And remorse is a lot better because it means I can change my behavior. Whereas guilt is all about me, I'm so terrible. And he said it's a way to escape the need to change. Guilt is something that keeps you.
We're laughing because of the shifting signifiers.
Yeah. I mean, this is that of course is exactly the opposite of the way Don was.
That use of the word guilt is exactly what I've been
That's our problem.
Yes,
That is our problem.
That's our
We cannot keep asking.
Igmar Bergman.
Because a Buddhist will tell us from their perspective, and someone treating psychotics will tell us from their perspective.
So is there any evidence that you know of that says that guilt as we use it is in fact an emotion?
Well, we don't, as we use it is interesting because we're not quite sure.
We use it in different ways. So if
It's used in many different ways.
If you try to describe anxiety, you don't use 20 different definitions. If you try to describe joy, you don't use 20 different definitions. But it seems to me when you come to guilt, everybody has their description of guilt. And it's usually based, like in your case, on an observation of the behavior in a child, which could be interpreted half a dozen different ways. In your description, it has to do with concern, then you bring a whole set of other ideas into it. But if it is an emotion, it doesn't need all of those. It either is an emotion and exists as such, and you feel it.
That's a really interesting proposition. So, what do we mean? I use those terms to mean the emotion, but I'm interested in the elicitors and the behaviors which signify it. It turns out in the study of emotion, we're going to get really into trouble because the question is, what is an emotion? Is it a bodily state?
Anybody disagree with the following? As a minimal, not by any means a complete definition of guilt, but a minimal definition. Guilt is a bad feeling you have when you feel you've done something wrong by your own lights.
No, I don't agree. I do not agree.
What's wrong with it?
Well, as I've ineffectively tried to convey, there's a much more pervasive, I think, structureless, atmospheric kind of guilt, and one doesn't know who is guilty or why.
I don't know what you're saying.
I'm talking about something like Kafka might describe, and I take that to be extremely real. And
Kafka's main character in the trial feels guilty.
Yes.
Why is there a problem?
But you don't know why.
No, he doesn't know why. I didn't say in my definition you had to know why. I did say.
I feel that. I do feel that. Or I have a vision. It's visionary, hallucinatory. That when I said that guilt is sort of like is part of a more formless radioactive background of our being, psychical background, emotional background of our being, that we try to configure or constellate in ways that make us causal agents. I did it. Mm-hmm. You did it. That is now a contraction, a configuration, a structuration of something that's more undifferentiated, that's more infinitized, that's just sort of like everywhere, that's sort of like boundless or doesn't have a location. I'm trying to pin it down. I'm trying to pin it down to where I'm at, to me, or where you are. It's your fault. It's my fault. But I think we're inserted in an emotional field that doesn't have such tight boundaries or agentified or subject boundaries. It's almost as if there are these states looking for a subject, and then the subject somehow organizes it to fit his picture of who he is.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that maybe we're saying the same thing, Michael, but the way I'm seeing it is that it's very hard for us to isolate one particular state, like guilt, because there's so many different other things going on at the same time. The degree of consciousness, awareness of the guilt, the degree of guilt, how often it happens, whether there's also some accompanying shame, the other resources we have as well as experiencing this guilt. So I just think it's very hard to just say all we're experiencing is guilt. I think there's a lot of interactions going on which color our responses. So I don't know whether that's another way of saying what you're saying.
We don't have to be the same. You're doing your thing.
No, but what I'm doing, we're all part of the same concept.
I like what you're saying. I like it. I'm sort of a synesthesic type, so that what you're saying definitely appeals to layers. Well, in any case, I like what you're saying very much.
I'd like different moments we might have different experiences of guilt. It's not always the same.
Yes, I think it's a jukebox kind of thing.
Able to define it.
There's somebody back there.
Okay,
that guilt and shame are so pervasive, what would you consider sort of a healthy resolution to guilt? And I know there's different levels of guilt.
First of all, I do think they're so pervasive. It's part of the social, on a functional level, they're part of the social field. It's what sensitizes us to each other. And it can go haywire to sort of our psychotic register, our totalizing, infinitizing, boundless aspect, or our cognitive. Let's tie it up into this differentiated box, which is really a secret ploy, an imperialistic ploy to valorize my particular identity field. But what we can do, I think, and we're in infancy. We're in infancy, and it's what evolution, I think, requires us to do is to partner all these different capacities as best we can, little by little, and make room for them. To make room for ourselves, make room for our capacities, make room for the capacities that constitute us that we know very little about, and that we organize this way, organize that way, and to somehow begin to partner them better rather than just split. This is this, and to begin to learn from it. Let them speak.
Okay, there's a question.
Thanks. Given that guilt is an uncomfortable state to feel, right, or emotion, what would induce us to take this feeling on? Why as people do we assume this? And also I'm curious about whether you think guilt has been kind of diminished in the popular discourse over a period of time, and whether that's the New Age movement or Reagan or it's kind of feels with time.
Can I address this? I think there's absolutely no doubt that guilt and superego has been lost sight of in large sections of psychoanalytic discourse since the 1960s. Arlo Sandler talked about how in the indexing of cases at the Hampstead Clinic, for 20 years, no one was indexing cases in terms of superego. They were indexing them in terms of transference and countertransference and ego issue, but never in terms of superego. Wormser describes the superego as the sleeping giant of contemporary psychoanalysis. I think this is to do with the 60s. Many of us are products of the 60s. The 60s was a huge rebellion against the superego. Christopher Lasch in 1970-something wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism. The old joke is that the superego is soluble in alcohol. It's even more liquidatable in narcissism. I mean, narcissism doesn't want anything to do with guilt. But coming back to your question about what would induce someone to want to feel guilt, one of the big things that will induce people to take on guilt, by which again I mean concern leading to reparation, is the relief that comes from that. In other words, instead of being plagued with painful states of shame that I then have to go and do desperate things to try to get out from under, I learn that if I can actually look at the harm that I've done, am doing, wish to do, whatever, take responsibility for that, repent, change, stop doing those things, apologize, repair, my life gets better. I'm not plagued with these terrible disintegrative states of fragmentation and shame and so on anymore.
That's healthy guilt.
Well,
my life feels better. That's why you do it. That's why you move.
I think the question is, well, why should we have any fear? Or why should we have anger? Or why should we have sadness? I don't think that, I mean, we can have just so stories to explain why we should have them, and evolutionary biologists today get into this, and they're just so stories. But the fact is that we do have them, and the fact is that they would be pathology if you didn't have them, or if you have too much of it. So somewhere, it's okay to have some of these. Too much guilt? I think various people here would be very unhappy about. Too much shame for sure. Too little as well. So it seems in trying to address in a round table, you always kind of get your back to someone. But it seems to me that fundamentally that the human condition is such that these emotions occur. Now, the question is, how do they occur? What accounts for individual differences? We can start looking at, rather than asking patients about their childhood and what they think of their parents, we can actually, in normative studies, do that. Look at what mom does, and you get some interesting things. Like I was starting to say, it's Dweck, but it's other people as well. It turns out that when moms do certain things, some interesting things seem to occur, depending on whether you're going to accept the definition of these kinds of things.
Let's have one.
I think that there is, with all the evolutionary importance of emotions generally and guilt in particular, I think that there can be a kind of motivational underpinning to the experiences of guilt. And I don't think that contradicts anything that you're saying. One thing, as you were talking, that I was thinking of, the story of Oedipus as it's told at the beginning and the end of the play, of Sophocles' play. At the beginning, there's a plague, and Oedipus comes on stage and says, "I am the only person who can solve this problem," basically, and everybody agrees with him. By the end of the play, the revelations about his what he's done and also about his history have threatened at least to destroy him, and he comes on stage and says, "Only I can bear the guilt of this." And what you see is the recruitment of guilt in the preservation of character, and in the denial of the pushing away of really appreciating all that's happened to him, and not just what he's done. So in that way, you can use guilt as a way of sustaining a kind of characterological style.
Mm-hmm. And I would give that status. Well, I think you would agree, clearly. Sure. I would also give that status to shame, by the way. And you would deprive it of. But I would give that status, and I would give it to fear, and I'd give it to anger, mm-hmm. and I'd give it to surprise and curiosity. Mm-hmm. The status of these things, emotion, as you tried to get the conversation to, that status may be qualities of humanness which are recruited in a variety of ways, sometimes really pathological, mm-hmm. and sometimes in the service of interpersonal life and living together and supporting one another. I mean, where does empathy? I mean, do we teach empathy? I don't think so. I think human beings have this substance. I don't know what it is, and people are trying to measure it, and they can go to the brain, which is what we, not yet, but we could. It's a kind of thing, and it gets recruited in different cultures in different ways in the normative sense, and in the pathological sense may be recruited for biological reasons. I mean, I'm a little reluctant to start talking about psychoses as interpersonal, the consequence of interpersonal. The increasing evidence is that we may do best not to do that. This may be really some very basic biological brain chemistry problems, but it seems to me that what we want to do is, for the time being, as a start, because people are trying to get some consensus, is to say that these are things humans have, and they are recruited in a variety of ways, and they can be pathological. I mean, I think that you were trying to get us to a broad statement, and as chair, that's always great to do. But we couldn't get agreement. Could we get agreement then for something simpler, that there are substances that human beings have, maybe out of evolutionary history, and they get recruited in the same way that fear isn't taught. What you are fearful of and how fearful you are is taught, but not fear, not the substance, whatever that might be. That's a quality of humankind.
I summoned you. I think we need to close.
think there's one question.
Is there one last question?
Can we just talk for 1 minute about what's known as survivor's guilt? Because, I mean, certainly in terms of the definition you were proposing where someone has done something and feels responsible for it, I mean, this certainly defies that definition, and I think it's one of the more fascinating and dramatic forms of guilt.
Does it really? Unconsciously, I would suppose in survivor's guilt you believe that you're responsible for the person's death, or that he somehow deserves it, and you don't deserve the fate you've gotten, which is to be spared that. I think.
Well, how would that be? I mean, if that were the case, if the latter, how would that be that you were responsible?
Well, it wouldn't be a rational belief. It would be an irrational belief. But the belief would be that somehow you're at fault.
Can we give a case example here? I had a patient who had a father who had the habit of dropping his affection for the existing child for the baby all the time. And my patient, for 5 years, had enjoyed the privileged status of being his favorite, the only daughter, at the expense of her two older brothers who'd been dropped in favor of her. And then when she was 5, her baby sister was born. And 3 years later, the baby sister drowned in the family swimming pool when my patient was 8. And she, of course, was on some level convinced that she'd murdered her sister. She convinced the psychiatrist to give her sodium amytal regression to take her back to the day that it happened to try and discover whether she really had killed the sister. It turned out she was nowhere near. And so that's survivor guilt. She would not allow herself to achieve any success, any fulfillment, any real happiness in life. She was very talented. She couldn't use her talents. This was all punishment for this crime of having killed her sister, even though rationally she knew she hadn't. But she only got relief when, in the analysis, she discovered that she'd wanted to kill her sister, of course. Why wouldn't she have wanted to kill her sister?
But are you saying that this must be true in every single case of survivor's guilt? That it's always because it was an unconscious?
I just thought it would be useful to give us a concrete example of a type of survivor guilt.
I think that...
I just wonder what could be the other reasons one would want to invent
I think that survivor guilt is very widespread. I think the guilt gets attached, has this double arrow. On the one hand, life, and on the one hand, death. The guilt gets attached to aliveness. I feel guilty for being alive. My aliveness somehow makes me feel guilty or has guilt in it for some reason.
Because of the fantasies.
Well, there'd be a lot of reasons, but in any case, it seems to be there's a lot of guilt for being alive.
Well, number one, not everyone who has it. So we can't make it a normative statement. It is not a normative statement. Only some people. No, we have no data on how widespread it is. We only know it's widespread if they come to your office. Those who don't come to your office, you don't know about, and so you don't know what the base rate is. And I'm not sure it is. But we don't know the ones who come what in fact they did do.
I think
they did survive, and in very bad. Let me just finish. In very bad situations, surviving may well mean that you have to do aggressive. You have to grab that piece of food, which the other one and the other one didn't get.
We're also here. We're also here because other people aren't. There's always a background of those who didn't make it while we made it, and I think but there is a more general existential. I do think for many, there's this that the sense of that we're guilty for being alive to a certain extent, and what I tried to bring out earlier is on the other side that we're guilty that there should be death in the world. It's like myths blame us for the fact that there's any death, and we try to say, well, it's someone else brought life into the world, but I brought death into the world. But I feel guilty for both.
But I guess my point is that it's more imagined and created rather than for a reason where I, chose to commit an action.
The reasons vary because you pick reasons that either fit the situation or intrinsic to the situation and has some justification. or you have a fantasy about it, like Donald was bringing out, like a hostile fantasy, or simply you find a reason to justify the guilt feeling. You find a reason to justify something that's more pervasive in one's life.
I want to thank you. This is my question and my problem and my old worry, and thank you all for coming together and talking about it with me.